The views and opinions expressed in this podcast by the host or the guest do not necessarily reflect the views of Paranormal Buzz Radio or its sponsors. Use of any material produced by Paranormal Buzz Radio without express written consent is strictly prohibited. For information on everything Paranormal Buzz Radio has to offer, visit our website, paranormalbuzzradio.com. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram. Listener discretion is advised.
Listen in as your host, Casey Colburn, brings together a perfectly picked panel of guests to discuss hot topics and events within the metaphysical and paranormal field. But don't worry, should the discussions get too heated, our studio's witch will sound her cackle to simmer the cauldron back down. Listen for new episodes of Cauldron Talk with Casey Colburn every Wednesday night at 6 p.m. only on Paranormal Buzz Radio. This is Season 1, Episode 5, and we are talking about Voodoo, Hoodoo, and Voudon. I'm your host, Casey Colburn, and today we are welcoming to our circle Lilith, Dorsey, and Atu Witch Doctor. Welcome to Cauldron Talk, guys. How are we all doing today?
Good.
Doing great over here.
Before we jump in, would you mind telling me a little bit about yourself?
Well, ladies first, Lilith.
Oh, all right. My name is Lilith Dorsey. I'm a voodoo priestess. I have a New Orleans-style voodoo house here in Brooklyn, New York. And I'm also initiated in Haitian Voodoo and in Lukumi. I have the largest voodoo blog in the world, Voodoo Universe. And I'm also, as Utu is too, a member of the Voodoo Spiritual Temple in New Orleans with Priestess Miriam and the late Priest Ashwan on 1428 North Rampart.
So my name is Utu, and I'm also an author, and I wrote the book Conjuring Harriet Tubman and the Spirits of the Underground Railroad. And as Lilith said, I'm a member of the New Orleans Voodoo Spiritual Temple, as is she, and we've both known each other for 20 years. And my house that I live in is actually a little temple called the Niagara Voodoo Shrine here in St. Catharines, where Harriet Tubman brought her Underground Railroad track to its end.
That's awesome. So my questions for you guys today is, what is Voodoo, Hoodoo, and Voudon?
Okay, well, there are three varieties of ATR, which is African traditional religion. Voodoo is usually the term that's given to the New Orleans style of practice. As I mentioned earlier, Utu and I belong to the New Orleans Voodoo Spiritual Temple. And the New Orleans Voodoo is really unique from anywhere else. It has its own set of practices. For me, I like to describe it as sort of like a gumbo because the city's a gumbo. There's so many different things that go into the practices, and there's so many other, ways of doing things in New Orleans that are different from doing them anywhere else. Why? There's still, like in our house, there's, a lot of different influences from the people that have passed through the temple over the years. Whereas Haitian Vodou, because of the isolation of Haiti and the political structure of Haiti, is sort of different than the way that we do things in New Orleans. In Haiti, the practices are called Vodou primarily. You can spell it lots of different ways because Creole is one of those languages that you can spell lots of different ways. But again, they're all really based, I think, on honoring the ancestors. There's a series of practices, rites, rituals, initiations that you go through, and it all harkens back to Africa. Hoodoo's more of, for me, my definition of hoodoo is it's more of a folk magic tradition. It's sort of what Southern conjure was practiced by a lot of the African-American people who didn't have a more structuralized form due to slavery and oppression and all of those things. But now we've got people practicing all different kinds, I mean, it's funny to me because I never really added hoodoo because I felt like that's what I grew up doing and that's what everybody else I knew grew up doing. So I didn't even really think of it as a practice any more than I would think of, getting up and brushing my teeth or making breakfast, because you just did all of these things in order to keep yourself safe and your house safe and the people that you loved safe. And it's more, like I said, sort of a hedge witch folk magic kind of tradition where you use what you have on hand to do things to make the best magic. That's my thoughts. Anyway, what do you think, Utu?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Just the other day, I was having a conversation with somebody about the difference, and so sometimes I like to point out that hoodoo kind of is a great example of why, the difference between Catholicism and Protestant religions influenced, right, on the African traditional religions. So where there was the Catholics, mostly in the South and the Caribbean, there was, the slavers had large populations of slaves in their keeps. So there was more of a community approach to those practices, as it is in Louisiana too. Whereas hoodoo, was a little bit more removed from the extreme plantation South, and it was more Protestant influence. Protestants were a lot more cruel. They didn't have as many saints and elements of what Catholicism does, so it became more of a singular practice, somebody doing something on their own. Again, that's a broad generalization, but it is kind of why hoodoo is more or less something that, a single individual would do or a small family does. And so therefore it doesn't require or usually include drummers, dancers, clergy, so on and so forth. So that's the only thing I would add in there sometimes about what hoodoo kind of can be.
I like that. I like that comparison. I think it makes it easier for people to understand who grew up with those kinds of, traditions and differences.
So the thing that stuck out to me that you just mentioned was the dancing and all that. So I'm Native American, and to me that it sounds very similar to like what powwow actually means to us. Is there any sort of like maybe crossing of that?
I mean, there's definitely obviously a lot of people who also are, African American and Native people as well. So I think that there's been a lot more embracing of that. I know I have a goddaughter in Pittsburgh, and they've been running an event that sort of draws on the parallels between both traditions. And I found that very interesting. And I think the way we go about it is very similar. I also have degrees in my undergrad and my grad in anthropology. And I know a lot of my friends did field work in different Native societies. You mentioned the dance. I have a friend who did his field work with the Kwakwakiwak in British Columbia. And I think that a lot of the way that you enter into ceremony as a dancer, a lot of the mindset that goes into it and what is behind it is really similar. I'm a dancer and a choreographer for Dr. John. It's actually his birthday today, and I miss him terribly. But, when I was studying some of the dances that went into the rituals, the kalinda and some of those things that they do at the Envelope, some of those things that they do in New Orleans that were the preparation for it, the actual, like I said, mindset and the way the dancers function as part of a ritual was very similar. I found that very fascinating.
Yeah, it's interesting. So you just mentioned that, that you're Native American. And so, Lilith has just explained perfectly that. So, me, I'm not even from this continent, but, as a drummer, and as an observer and a quasi-historian, at least, like the idea is a lot of dances, right? I think they're rooted in struggle. Like when things are obviously, when a culture is celebratory, celebrating passage rights, then there's certain dances. But then, I think the Native Americans of this continent have definitely, had to invent dances that literally were laments because they were being literally eradicated. So that's a lot of some of the dances in voodoo as well, is that they're, enacting things that are like, codes, messages, symbolism. And again, it takes a community to do it. And so, that's a similarity. Of course, in hoodoo and conjure and in American voodoo, you'll find a lot of Native American romanticism involved in it because, that's the other culture of people that were also under the struggle of the colonizers. So a lot of voodoo and root work and conjure, some of the candles and oils are very influenced by Native American names, Lucky Indian and so on and so forth. There's a lot of that sort of, the animal totemic magic is sometimes incorporated in it as well, because that's what the African had to do. They were being, trying to cling to their traditions. And so some of their dances had a code to it. And then, of course, they were, learning what the ethnobotany of this continent was. So those are the similarities, I think.
I think there's also, you mentioned it, the envelope, there's the way we do it in New Orleans, it's very coded to sort of like attack the oppressors. You know, there's movements where you do them and you're supposed to, that means, you know, okay, tonight we're going to meet and we're going to cut heads off of things. You know, it really makes me think about a lot of those, you know, spiritual songs that, you know, Harriet Tubman was singing and things like that. They really were coded messages, that the music and the movements and the dances and all of that really, you know, were telling people instructions on how to do something, you know, and also telling a story too. I think that comes into it in play a lot of times, that I think is something we don't necessarily see in other cultures.
So it's interesting that you actually brought up Harriet Tubman, because my next question for you guys is actually, what are some historic figures that come to mind for the practice?
Okay, so I'm supposed to go first. I'll let you take Harriet Tubman, Uju, but, you know, people talk a lot about Marie Laveau. I mean, I think the media has definitely popularized Marie Laveau lately as the first main popular voodoo queen of New Orleans. And she's somebody that a lot of people still honor today, you know, not just because she showed up on television, but because they really do feel a deep connection. You know, I did a documentary about New Orleans voodoo, and I talk about how her grave is the second most visited in the United States after Elvis. So it's funny to me that she gets well, not funny, it's actually really pleasing to me that she gets as many visitors as she does, even though access has been restricted as of late, you know. And I mentioned Dr. John, the jazz musician, but he took his name from Dr. John Montagny, who was the original priest and drummer for Marie Laveau. So I think that name definitely stands out. I know that you were talking about, you know, also Haitian Voodoo. Some people say Toussaint Louverture, but a lot more Haitians will tell you that Desline was actually, you know, devoted to Ogun, and that's why a lot of the practices are very heavily focused on Ogun. I did a video about it on my YouTube channel about some of the historical figures that were responsible for the Haitian Revolution and what their connection to voodoo was.
Yeah, so Marie Laveau, absolutely, as Lilith said, a bona fide historic figure that was immersed in voodoo. A lot of other historic figures, also, like Lilith said, it's shrouded in controversial. So yes, I will go on record to say that, you know, and I'm not the only one that believes this or knows this for a fact, that Harriet Tubman was indeed a conjure woman, not necessarily a voodoo practitioner by any stretch, but a conjure woman. And that also entails elements of what we were saying earlier. It entails elements of Christianity, the Bible, the Holy Spirit. And then a lot of times you'll find in conjure and root work that, especially when it comes to the Underground Railroad, Exodus, the segments of Exodus in the Bible were a big part of it, because it was about, you know, breaking free from your enslaver and getting emancipation, making it to the promised land, to freedom, via Moses. So, you know, most of the Underground Railroad historic figures, even the white ones, were associated with spiritualism. And spiritualism is, you know, it's unique because it's so popular now, called other names, you know, spiritism or spiritismo in the Latin communities. But they're all offshoots of the spiritualism that was born in New York State, in the burned over district. It was born there from radical Quakers who were experimenting with communicating with the afterlife and combining that with the freedom seekers on Underground Railroad and their ways of working with their ancestors. And so that's where seance was born. And so quite a few of the famous white abolitionists were also immersed in something that would be called the occult. And that could be said for a great majority of some of the most historic figures in the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman, John Brown, Sojourner Truth, you know, even Mary Ellen Pleasant. These people were all immersed in a type of spirituality that we would define today as conjure, root work, for some of them voodoo, but then for some other people, that's just, you know, Christian mysticism as well. It's a fine line. And, well, now that he's dead, it is fairly accurate to say that even Fidel Castro was also initiated in Santeria. And so that's pretty much a fact.
It actually makes a lot of sense to me for, especially anybody that's going through any sort of struggle, to really reach out to these, because these are, to me, it's all natural medicines. And when you are going through struggle, you know, it's something you have to do. You know, if you're sick, you go for, you know, the type of medicine that you need for while you're sick. So if you're going through any sort of spiritual struggle or like physical struggle, you're going to reach for what you need. That's something that I've always kind of believed in. Children naturally will do that. At least in my family, they naturally go for the medicines that they need. And it could, when I say medicines, it doesn't mean like penicillin or Tylenol. It means like, it could just be running outside and playing. It could be like picking dandelions for skin wounds. All sorts of things like that. For my third question, why has voodoo been feared?
Well, that's a good question. There's a lot of, you said you wanted to dispel misconceptions. And I think one of the reasons it was feared is because there is a lot of misconceptions. It's an oral tradition because it had to be an oral tradition. This is stuff that was, even, yes, obviously the slaves were not allowed to practice any sort of voodoo or voodoo or any kind of magic like that. They weren't even allowed to read in a lot of cases, so you're obviously going to have a tradition that's an oral tradition as it is transplanted and practiced in North and South America, because that's the people that brought it over here wholesale, through the Middle Passage. And I think that because it's a secret, people can, use it to make things up. I mentioned I have an anthro degree. I also have a degree in cinema and television studies. And if we look at what the media has portrayed about hoodoo and voodoo and voodoo, it's been some diabolical crap, hands down. It's full of, starting in the very beginning with white zombie and all of these things that are so not part of what the practices are, but this is all people know. And when they hear about it, it's something that they have those images that have been put into their head for, if we look at white zombie, that's almost 100 years old now at this point. So we've been having these kinds of horrible media, representations by the West for so long that I think that's a lot of what it was. And then part of the other thing is that, if somebody's raping you and stealing your children and killing your mother and, obviously you're going to develop magic that is a strong response to some pretty extreme times. So yes, I think it did have more kinds of spells and rituals and things like that for doing harm to people, but that's because people were doing harm to them. So, we had to do what we had to do in order to survive. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here today. So we had to have those kinds of things. And yes, you can go into a Botanica or a Haitian voodoo store and buy a bunch of weirdo candles for, doom from my enemies and things like that. But, they had enemies, and some of us today still have enemies. So these things, are necessary. That's my take on it anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I obviously can't disagree with that. And so just on a side note, I just rewatched White Zombie a few nights ago by complete accident.
Oh, really?
I came across it online and I couldn't believe it. And all I could think of was like, wow, that sure is a lot of white people for Haiti, all these zombies. Like, where'd they all come from? But, crazy movie. But, so, yeah, let's be real as well in a way. Don't forget, not long ago, witchcraft, which we all have now accepted as soccer mom mysticism for some parts of North American culture, was once quite vilified. And that's because people feared it because they didn't know it. Because before the internet, if you were going to be exposed to actual traditional witchcraft, the way it came to the Americas, you had to join a coven. You had to go through a gauntlet. And much like the African traditional religions, it was initiatory. It was within secret houses and places that you went to and stores that had after-hours secret things. That's how you learned it. So it's very easy to mystify it and make it mysterious. And witchcraft is only now, in the last 20 years, come out to now be considered by some to be a love and light, harm none, tree-hugging type of a religion, which is, it's a falsity. But, thankfully, at least some of the stigma is removed. But for voodoo, all those things are still the same, except the one obvious is that it's also rooted in blackness. And so there is definitely an element of racism there. I mean, it's just obvious that it makes it very easy for a lot of people to now accept witchcraft as well. That's Wicca, and it's much more peaceful. Whereas the ethnics, the way people think in North America, and being obviously generalization, but it's pretty accurate that for a lot of people to see people of color, in ceremony, then it's considered more, archaic and barbaric because it must be primal and must be different, when really it's no different. Their ceremonies then, as we were just saying earlier, than a Native American traditional dance, in some regards, no different than a European traditional dance, because the Europeans have traditional dances rooted in paganism too. So, there is definitely racism, and that is, just like Will said, it has definitely been promoted by Hollywood. I mean, it's kind of to the point now where I remember, like, I'm a little older, and I think Lilith and I can both remember, in the 90s. Sure, well, I didn't want to say anything. I'm not saying our age. But, not long ago, witches were protesting movies like Hocus Pocus. They didn't like those movies when they came out. The public witches decried them in public. They publicly said these movies are terrible. And now it's like they're the favorite movie of witches now. People are screaming for part 2, and it's like the favorite movie. So suddenly in the last few years, generalization, but I've noticed now that some of the voodoo movies or conjure movies, like, for example, Skeleton Key, that seems to be the popular one, I guess, where now there's people kind of like in our traditions are sort of can now enjoy it a little bit, laugh and go, oh, I like that movie. But at the same time, we know it's not exactly doing us a great service, but it is what it is. But yes, Hollywood it definitely hasn't helped. That's for sure. And they didn't help with witchcraft movies, and they still aren't. Right now, you still find a lot of negative movies about traditional witchcraft, where it's Rosemary's Baby, it's ring a bell. I mean, they're giving up a baby to Satan. So, mass Hollywood, mass media doesn't really do it great. But at one point, it was literally because these traditions, you used to have to go through a gauntlet to get there. We're in the internet age now, and anyone can go on the internet, do a little research, and presto, they're a conjure person, they're a high priestess, they're a this, they're a that. And that's kind of why I think it's become so commercialized now and sort of, accepted, is because it's kind of become benign in a way for some.
No, I think so. I mean, you were talking about all of those, and I just, for a minute, to bring it back to Harriet, the Conjure movie I like the best is Eve's Bayou, which was directed by Cassie Lemons, who directed Harriet. And I think that was the wisest choice they could have made under the circumstances, really, because, it allowed them to have someone who had a Black female sensibility about a Black female story, and somebody who was able to see magic and things. I mean, again, I haven't seen Cassie Lemons go on the record saying whether or not she's a practitioner, but from her visual style, you can see that she certainly appreciates the magic of things. For those who haven't seen either, it's very experimental. And I think that's something when you're trying to creatively represent magic in a form like that it needs to be something that is experimental and out there.
Yeah, it's funny because, if you were to, I mean, there's so much controversy, and just, I mean, even today, what is today's headlines? That 25 years ago, that very script, the movie Harriet, that a Hollywood executive was saying, let's get Julia Roberts to play her. Like, yes. Now that's in the news now, on top of all the other controversy that the movie Harriet has brought. But, just to stay on the fact of Cassie Lemons, like, yeah, in the movie Harriet, she literally actually just straight out says, well, in my movie, she has supernatural powers. And in all accounts, the reality is, according to people that traveled with Harriet Tubman, people that supported her and gave her money and enabled her, they all said this about her, and including the people that traveled with her. So, it's not inaccurate. It's just that she decided to make an artistic, display of it by showing some of how maybe her visions were, which I enjoyed. I totally understand the controversy of the movie, even if some of it at first, was lost on me a little bit, because I was just kind of still in shock and awe that I just seen a movie of Harriet Tubman on a big screen. I saw it with a pretty diverse crowd. And so, when I came out of it, one of the people that was at the theater with me was another Scottish man who's got the full accent. And when we walked out, we were like, well, that was kind of like Braveheart, right? I mean, just zero historic accuracy. One of our most sacred heroes played by a foreigner. I can see how this is going to go, but, we still enjoyed it. And it was an interesting movie to watch.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you mentioned before a certain age. I think that, there's a people who are around our age or older get so happy for these representations. And it takes, my daughter's generation and some of these millennials to come up and sort of raise other questions because, they ask more than just being happy to see a representation on screen.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, the media does some really, really weird things. It's if they don't like the story, if they say it doesn't make a good story, then they'll change it. And I mean, it's even in children's stuff like Pocahontas. That's not any way how that went down. But that, growing up, I didn't know. Like, I still thought it was cool. Like, there was a Native American on TV that was, cool. But after I learned what her actual story was, I was like, well, it's still like it's her story. You can't really just change it because it doesn't sound good to you. But that's what the media does.
Yeah, definitely. It's the money. It's the money, and I'm surprised it got made. I know it took this long, but I'm surprised it got made. Honestly.
Yeah, I mean, not to just keep going on about the Harriet Tubman movie, but it's true. Like it's people that I know here in Ontario that are Underground Railroad descendants and have a pretty strong opinion about a lot of things Harriet Tubman related. It was a divided line of some of them just being absolutely just horrified that a Nigerian British woman was going to play her, as meanwhile on the other side, a few others were like, they didn't care as long as it was a movie being made. But, when you think about it, like, again, it was a black screenwriter, a black director, a very solid black cast. Why they chose to tell the story they did is something that'll be debated for a very long time. And it's come around in circles. There were some false narratives out there about what was in the movie. It's taken a while for people to realize that's not true. But, when you watch it, there definitely is a couple of things in there that were thrown in that even right in the middle of the movie, I was talking to the person sitting beside me, a person of color. I was like, what the hell is that doing in there? What is this doing going on? What the hell is this? But I was still just sort of like locked on the screen and just sort of still just analyzing every second, still going like, I can't believe this movie is happening. Like, wow. But it's complex.
Definitely.
Is practicing voodoo, hoodoo, or voudon, is it dangerous?
Well, it works. So that must make it dangerous just to start with. I mean, I think that you're doing seriously can be dangerous. Like I said, I mean, if you're doing serious magic, serious intent and serious consequences are going to follow. So you have to do it responsibly. And I think one of the reasons I think that part of what I do is not as popular as some of my, Insta famous cohorts is because, it does take work. It does take responsibility. We mentioned before initiation and respect and devotion to a teacher, which I think is something that's difficult. And if you don't have these things, it certainly can be dangerous, and there's so many people out there, I'm not a name kind of person, but there's so many people out there that are doing dangerous things, and it's really, it's a parent-child relationship, and any parent-child relationship that you enter into can have consequences if you don't have a good parent and if you're not a good child. So I think that's something that everybody can understand. I mean, I know that Utu and I both think of Miriam as our spiritual mother. And, I've been with her for 28 years and I love her dearly and my whole family loves her and it's great. It's like old home week, but when you're trying to protect someone, when you're trying to cure someone. I mean, Priestess Miriam likes to say that all magic is healing magic. And when you're trying to heal someone of something serious, whether it be a physical illness or a situation that's dangerous to them, then, it can be a tricky business if you don't know what you're doing. That's what I have to say about that.
Yeah, one thing I've been enjoying that I've been seeing in some of my social media feed lately, based on a couple of our mutual friends, and I'll at least name drop this one. It's coming a lot from like Christian Day, Brian Kane, the Hex crowd. To remind people that witchcraft, just take away voodoo, witchcraft and magic is dangerous. It's supposed to be. It's not a hobby. whenever you're probing the world of the occult and probing into the realm of spirit through ritual, formula, and experimentation, you're opening up a lot of doors. And so, yeah, it can affect you. And then I think the big mistake a lot of people do is they want to gravitate right away to doing baneful curse and hex work. That has its own sort of like, it's like jumping into a puddle or in mud without the right gear. You get a lot of splashback if you don't do it right, and you open yourself up to a lot of strange things. And then, when it comes to danger, well, then another thing is, you should probably be a legitimate part of these traditions before you claim to be, because that's going to be dangerous for your PR, that's for sure. But, it should be dangerous. And I think it should have a healthy dose of respect. And especially if you're going to enter into, again, all witchcraft, Wicca is dangerous. It absolutely is. It has elements of that. So why would or any of the other African traditional religions be any different? They're going to have an element of danger. And if you're going to wander in also into other ethnicities and cultures, magics, then you're going to ask for trouble there too. And for example, don't underestimate the calamity that can happen by messing with feng shui the wrong way. That's Asian sorcery, Chinese sorcery to keep demons away, and make your house, radiate a certain way to ward off negativity. If you do that wrong, it can have some issues, and you can definitely, there's no magic that's not dangerous. However, in general, root work, conjure, voodoo, if you do it right and you have some respect and you're kind of adding some illumination and exaltation to the legacy, then you're doing more, that's something a little bit better, a little less dangerous, I think, because you're not trying to meddle in the affairs of some of that spirit world. You got to start with just being basic and having respect and love for these traditions. And then if you start there, the level of danger will be a lot less. There's no reason to even try to get into cursing and hexing. That takes a long time, in my opinion, and a lot of energy, and somebody should be really well versed before they even go there.
Oh, wait, I have to tell a story. Are you done, Uchu? I have to tell a story.
Oh, yeah.
So, I don't know how many years ago, when a fire ritual, and we had all different types of fire. Somebody was spinning fire, and somebody had, these mushroom spores that would float and go on fire in the air. And I was doing the fire machete. And afterwards, like way afterwards, when we were cleaning up, we heard these two little kids going, "We can try this at home. Mommy has a machete and Daddy has some gasoline." Like, no, don't do this. Don't do what we do. Be careful. So
yeah, don't dance with the flaming machete, kids.
No, don't do that. Be careful.
Yeah, I think that happens a lot too with just everything. People see something that they like and then they assume that it's easy to do and then they try it. Usually gets people into a lot of trouble because they do that. But yeah, that's kind of.
Well, have you heard some of the statistics these days about people making themselves sick using essential oils and trying to make some of these potions and powders that are akin to some of the root work or just at least, necromancy? Some of the stuff's poisonous. When you mix it together, it can become nauseous. And never mind essential oils. Not that long ago, you had to be a licensed aromatherapist to administer essential oils and how to use them. People are like consuming them. They're putting them on their skin way too much. They're getting rashes. They're getting sick. They're getting themselves autoimmune diseases. It's out of control. So, even that part of witchcraft and magic and root work and voodoo, which of course, like you were saying earlier about, Casey, about, medicines. Yeah, traditional medicines, natural medicines is a huge part of all of the African traditional religions, as well as should be traditional witchcraft. So, indigenous religions, are going to have natural medicines. And so some of them are poisonous. Some of them, you combine them and will make you sick, even if they have good elements to them. So, there's a lot of danger out there when people claim to be something and they're making with potions and oils and all kinds of stuff. And you just never know. So it's always best to just learn to crawl before you run,
Yeah, the essential oils, actually, when I was just doing dog training, I had to talk to a lot of people about, not using them on their pets, because like I had one client who would take lavender essential oil and rub it all over their cat. Well, cats don't digest oil.
Oh no.
And, they're like, well, they're not feeding it to them. I'm like, but when the cat licks itself, it is ingesting it. And like, you have to, like, I have macaws, I can't just, use any essential oil in a diffuser and call it good, because it'll kill them. I can't even use like Teflon pans, because it will kill them. And I think people don't really think about the pros and cons to things. A lot of the times they're just like, that one smells really good, I'm going to use it. And, it's not necessarily the best thing for the whole.
Wow, you piqued my interest when you mentioned training dogs and the birds. So you're obviously got a great connection to working with animals.
Yeah, actually, it was my first gift actually was to communicate with animals, and for my entire life I thought that was what I was supposed to do, and Spirit had other plans for me, and so now I'm much more into the paranormal and getting back to my spiritual being and doing all that for me, and now this podcast, so the podcast actually came out because basically, I got tired of hearing everybody gripe and complain about certain things and all the incorrect information that was being, spewed about. And so I was like, you know what? I'm going to do this. This is going to make it a good platform for everybody to kind of get the correct information, dispel all of the stigmas and issues. And, hopefully for the, few people that listen to this podcast, it will do that for them. It'll do good by them.
Well, I know that both Lilith and I, and obviously, Casey, you probably are going to be seeing the same thing. Is there's now becoming a very tangible bleed together of the paranormal and the spiritual community. And so, what I have noticed, having had the blessing of meeting quite a few renowned people in the para world, is that what's more dangerous than wandering into a haunted place that's got some negative energy and running in there and screaming at it, or trying to figure out what's going on with it. I think a lot of people in the paranormal fields probably could come at it with a bit more education as far as how to work with these sorts of places that have an actual power to it, with a little more respect, or maybe a more gentle approach sometimes. And now spiritual workers like myself and like Lilith and a few other contemporaries, we're doing a lot of cleansings and a lot of work with people that are in the paranormal field that have gotten something attached to them because they were in some place doing something and came back with something, and now they're feeling like there's something wrong. So, that's definitely an element of danger to me, more than any of the other things we talked about, because those worlds are colliding right now and all of our fields. And so I see a lot of potential for some pretty crazy things, and I've heard some crazy things happen.
Yeah, it definitely, when I go into these places, so for me, because I am a practicing medium, I look at it as kind of like a safe way of practicing, because there's still going to be some what ifs, some variables that I don't know, but for the most part, there's a lot of documented things that are going on at a location, like the Dunkirk Lighthouse and places like that. So when I go into those places, I know what to kind of expect already. So to me, it makes it a little bit more safe instead of just walking around completely open to spirit all of the time, because that can be dangerous and draining. So for me, that's why I go into these locations. But places like the Hinsdale House, I actually do offerings to the native spirits that are there before and after each investigation.
Interesting.
That's
because,
great.
Yeah, they really and truly appreciate that, and I give traditional stuff. So I'll do Palo Santo, sage, and sweetgrass, and I offer it to them, and I offer it to the Four Winds, and I tell them thank you for allowing me to be here. And so when I go into that, those type of locations, it's a little bit different for me, I think, than a lot of people. I'm sure there's probably couple people out there that are just like me, but as a whole, from what I've seen, it's a little bit different. This next question is all about acceptance. So is there more acceptance in today's world for practicing voodoo, hoodoo, and voudon? And is it more or less accepted for women practitioners versus men practitioners?
Well, that's interesting. Okay, acceptance. I mean, I think that just by virtue of being more visible in a positive way, as Utu mentioned, on the internet and through publications like blogs and, my book, his book, that, we're definitely more seen. And I think that makes it more normalized on some level and therefore a tiny bit more accepted. I mean, I think it's interesting because I've been doing it for, as I said, almost 30 years now. And I thought it would be more accepted after 30 years, honestly. I mean, it's not like necessarily going to get, my daughter's grown, but it's not like I'm necessarily think my neighbors are going to come and knock on my door and call child services because I'm a witch, which I did when, she was born almost 30 years ago. So that's definitely changed. And on that note, it's slightly safer because of that. But then, we run the risk. I did a panel discussion. I wasn't part of it, but I went to watch it with John Mason, who's a very famous Powwow here in New York City. He's written several books. And he said that, the religion was like a fractal. We could make it as small or as large as it needs to be. And for a long time, it was small, and it took place in people's basements and people's houses and things like that, as opposed to large public venues, because it was safe. And even though, we weren't still living under the oppression of slavery or something, supposedly we had religious freedom, it still wasn't necessarily safe for us to practice these things out in the open. And he was sort of putting it out there that this was a question that, was it going to be safe in the future? And this is sort of what a lot of the leaders from the community were discussing. Is it going to be safe for us to be as visible as we are being right now? And I think that question is still up in the air, It's definitely more accepted, but I still get weird looks. I mean, I had a neighbor once tell me, well, oh, it's okay, you're a voodoo priestess, at least you don't practice Santeria. And I was like, well, I kind of do, you crazy lady.
Right.
So it's just, there's still always going to be those kinds of things. And there's still a lot of division. I think for outsiders, what they don't really understand is there's a lot of division even within the ATRs. When I published my first book, Voodoo and Afro-Caribbean Paganism, it was about all the differences between all the different ATRs and how, I can't necessarily just be from Lakumi House and then go into a Haitian Vodou ceremony and know what people are talking about, because it's going to be very different. It's different energies, it's different entities. Some of them do similar things, but it's not exactly the same. And I don't think anybody should assume that. So that while it's more accepted, there's still a lot of things that are secret and hidden and not as much fluidity as I think most people really think in the traditions.
Yeah, true enough. And, I think there are still some people that will call child services on people for the fact that the woman is a witch or something. It's not as common, but, you hear about it. One thing I can say, so like, I obviously have a very strange, ability to observe, right? So again, I'm a white man. I'm not even from this continent, and I grew up in Canada. So, the people that I surround myself with here in Ontario, they have, people of color have, if they're Canadian, have a certain outlook about things. Sometimes they don't really, associate with the Caribbean narrative of religion or even the American. At the same time, there's a giant, West African population in the areas that I live in and I interact with. And so sometimes when these cultures have their celebrations, people think, oh, look, it's a cultural celebration. Same for the very large Puerto Rican population in Buffalo, right across the river from me. It's again, people just assume that it's a big celebration, but there's actually something going on there. So acceptance becomes this thing about who is it accepted by. So again, as a white guy, I can tell you that, it's a lot easier for me to be accepted amongst certain populations of white, a large group of white people, whether they be, people in the paranormal field or so on and so forth, because I make them comfortable, because I'm a white guy. And so therefore, there's a bit of privilege there. I'm easily relatable. And that's also the case that, I love the pagan community. I think it has a great deal more benefits than negative aspects, but Lilith can tell you, and I've seen it, and it's something that at first I did not notice way back in early, 2001 I was oblivious to it. Although I remember seeing people that were voodoo practitioners in the 90s when I was spending a lot of time down south, and always wondered, why are they at this pagan community? Because at one point, once I became immersed in voodoo, it became a stigma to a slight degree, even within the pagan community, that if you were a practitioner of voodoo or Santeria, you were considered nefarious, because it was an era of everybody wanting to make sure that their magic was all good. And because of everything we talked about earlier about the negative associations and sort of like stereotypical beliefs about things, those traditions were at times not allowed to even be presented or represented at pagan events. So that took a long time to change. Obviously, some people would just obliterate those lines. People like Priestess Miriam and Louis Martinet and Lilith's been doing this for a great deal longer than myself. But she's also a black woman and has literally experienced the racism within spiritual communities that I say I've observed, or at least have been told about. People don't really, say a lot of that kind of stuff around me, but it's because, I'm in a safe place, right, all the time. And so acceptance becomes down to who's accepting it. And I think that's why you see right now a huge amount of white people out there. I respect some of them. Some of them I think are completely full of it. But there they are, fully accepted, and they're saying all kinds of crazy things and showing up at all sorts of places and promoting certain things. So, acceptance becomes, is society accepting it? I say that probably all the different African traditional religions will just put under the umbrella of voodoo for now, probably still has a kind of a negative stigma to a great large swath of population. And again, even where I live, so people romanticize these traditions. So people will think, and it's a very ethnocentric way of thinking, I guess the term is, that, all black people practice voodoo, woodwork, and conjure. Well, the population of people here in St. Catharines that are Underground Railroad descendants, that are 2 historic houses of prayer, no. If you bring that up in that church, and I go to those churches, you're just made a big mistake. You might as well be saying that you have allegiance to the devil, and I'm not exaggerating. However, once you get out of that church and you go to a couple of their homes, what we would call voodoo and root work is just what Lilith said at the beginning. It's a family tradition. It's a way to protect your house. It's not something sensational. It doesn't usually have a brand or a name. So you'll be at times be in the southern United States in an all black neighborhood, and root work and voodoo is not accepted amongst them. Just as like you'll go to some whole white area and claim to be a white witch, and it's not going to go over too well. So it just depends. I think, obviously in more cosmopolitan cities and in places where there's a good healthy mix of cultures and people from other parts of the world, sure, some of these things are being more accepted, but there's still a lot of work to go.
I do also want to say, yes, I think you're definitely more accepted than I am because you're a white male, but I think you're also more accepted than I am because you're a musician. And not that I have anything against musicians. I love them dearly. But, we went to an event last weekend here in Brooklyn, me and my godson, and it was run by Reva Neri Priesel and her husband. And she's famous as a singer and a musician and through their music. And through that, they were allowed to, well, not allowed, but that particular gave them the opportunity to create spaces for Haitian Vodou here in the city that I think they would not have been afforded if they were not, musicians and musical people.
Totally true. And again, that was by design. So the band I'm in, the Dragon Ritual Drummers, we absolutely have been very lucky. And so because we're performing, then we can play the rhythms, tell some of the stories, and then because we're the ones that they paid to come to this event, then they offer us a ceremony, a ritual to do. So we will do them. But at one point, to go back to what I was saying earlier, when the Dragon Ritual Drummers early 2000s started to get really popular, we were smart, we did some good marketing, and just we became very well known across the entire continent for a while, especially where we lived in Canada. We started to have a negative association because everyone said, oh, they're voodoo drummers. These guys are voodoo drummers and they're bringing negative energy here. And people started to really make this an issue that our band had to publicly, back in the MySpace era, say, no, we're not a voodoo band. We're pagan drummers. We're all pagans, blah, blah, blah. And we couldn't stop it. And, for a while, then after a while, we had a meeting. It was like, you know what? Screw it. Some of us belong to these traditions. If they're going to call us that, let's just embrace it and let's use this as an opportunity to educate and to celebrate, and screw it. And so then we ended up just saying, yeah, if that's what we are, that's what we are. And we embraced it. So, but we were lucky. Not a lot of people want to, for too long go up against, 5 to 6 guys, even if it's online. It sort of has a sort of like a gang, feel to it. So we are lucky, and music does definitely bridge the gap, and it's true.
Yeah, I mentioned before Dr. John, and when I was at his memorial service, one of the Neville brothers got up, Cyril, and was like, he's responsible for putting black and white musicians on stage. And I think if Mac, which is Dr. John's real name, I think if Mac hadn't really embraced Hoodoo and New Orleans Voodoo the way he did, it would not be as popular today either. And I think pretty much everybody knows that that's part of his legacy in addition to the music and being open and out there. And I think, yes, he definitely got to a point where he was like, hell yeah, this is what I do. What are you going to do about it? You're still going to come see the music,
Yeah.
It's really kind of interesting how things get discriminated so quickly and how certain things can kind of bridge things a little bit, easier for certain things. Because, as being a practicing medium and a witch, I was working a vendor booth for a friend of mine who is also a medium, and she had a vendor booth and a reading table. And my friend does not practice any witchcraft or anything like that. She's just a medium. But I had a lady who was asking questions. She approached the table, and she's like, once I started talking to her about what was going on at the table and what certain things were, she was like, oh, I don't do witchcraft. And she threw her hands up and stormed away, almost like she was really super offended by it. And I'm like, well, neither does my friend, but I do. So that was just kind of a weird stigma that, I think a lot of mediums are looked at as being witches, and they're not. So going kind of where certain titles are put on you without, necessary cause.
Well, it's funny here up in some of the circles I run with, it's only been the last 3 years that I've really, fully immersed myself in levels of mediumship and channeling. My old tradition that I was part of had channeling as part of it. And so I'm very grateful for that. But I have noticed that when I'm in the sort of circles where there's an abundance of mediums, very much still a new age oriented, community. And so sometimes the people that come at it like myself, fully accepted and white male and all, it's still like, whoa, that's a little dark for me. The guy calls himself a witch doctor. What's all that about? Why is he wearing those things around his neck? All these things, So there's still, even in those circles, sometimes, certain mediums, they do not like to have, people that are, spiritual, working with spiritual forces sometimes, around, or they'll try to credit them because they'll say they're this negative magic. They're doing dark things, and it's kind of strange.
Yeah, I get that too. Cause, even growing up, my mom, she would always say, you're probably not going to be as accepted with this because, she would just say that we were feared. So the native power, she would say, is feared. People don't understand it. Or she would say that they understand that it's powerful, so they don't want anything to do with it. And she would, it was very short answers and kind of just to the point, I think, just to kind of maybe a little bit shield me from, the prejudices of certain things, but also I think just to answer enough just to keep it going.
No, I think that's how a lot of people lived for a very long time. And acceptance is hard won and fought for.
Okay, so my last thing for you guys today is, do you guys have any advice for anybody that maybe is a new practitioner or thinking about practicing, or just for our listeners?
Okay, my advice would be to, read my book, read Uchu's book. I mean, read things from people that you trust or that resonates with you deeply. Unfortunately, the internet and some authors out there are really full of crap. So, do your research beforehand. That's one of the things that I like to recommend people, and really listen to what people are saying. Are they saying something that you're like, what the hell is that? And then find a teacher. Again, I think that we were saying there's a lot of things in these religions that can be dangerous. There's a lot of pitfalls. There's even simple things that, one herb might be good for some person and not good for another. I always tell people it's like, some people have a peanut allergy and some people eat peanuts 3 times a day, so you need to have a guide or a teacher that can help you through divination, through conversations, through studying, through teaching, hopefully through initiation eventually, if that's what you want. That will really, sort of get you more in touch with who you are and what you need to learn and what your path is. A lot of these traditions focus on everybody having their own personal path, and it's similar to other forms of spirituality in that way. But I really truly think that that's true. What's good for one person might not be good for another. So if you have a family, if you have people that are good teachers, good people you can look up to, then that's going to be your best foot forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Read our books, and it's true. The idea of there are quite a few good authors out there, and even some of them, there's a bunch of them don't necessarily agree with what I'm all about either. So it doesn't really matter. There's some out there that have written some good books, and at least, especially if they write them from a place of educating you a little bit, as well as giving you a little bit of experimentation to work with. And then you have to be patient. So, and to not be fooled by, a lot of glitter and fancy, because, at the end of the day, I'll take me out of the equation, but, I know I've known law for, 20 years. So, but there are people out there that have only been around for 5 years, that have this type of a social media presence, and they just seem to be the authority. That's not always going to be the reality of what's actual truth here. So, there are some people that are going to do a bit of both. They're going to have some success with their writings and their teachings and some travel. But at the same time, there's going to be some that just have this amazing skill of branding themselves and making themselves look like they're actually an authority. And so a person has to do some diligent research to find out how long has that person been practicing. So if you're going to go and give money to somebody, or you're going to learn from somebody, see if they've been around for more than 5, to 10 years. That's a good thing to do. It's just, and then also ask yourself, why are you wanting to do it? I mean, that's what someone should ask themselves before they get involved in witchcraft, even, or Wicca. Why are you doing it? And so therefore you ask yourself the next question. Why do I want to get involved in Voodoo in the first place? I can only speak for me, right? And me, I would never have been involved in these practices if it wasn't for the fact that I already was a drummer. I was already drumming with hand drums. I was raised as a drummer. I played a lot of instruments. It was something I gravitated towards. And once I ended up finding out that there was spiritual traditions where I could just go and drum and add some service to it, I was like, well, this is great. And you do that long enough, eventually you get invited into those things, God's willing. And so if not, if someone would have told me, in the early 90s or mid 90s that, you're going to be part of really immersed in African American mysticism, I would have said, you're crazy. That doesn't even make any sense. And I want my money back, So, but that's how it goes. So, I think a lot of people forget, and I'm literally going to say something that, a black mystic told me, or has literally posted up there, that, Voodoo and root work is no more powerful, no more mysterious and mystical than witchcraft. Traditional witchcraft. It's just somebody else's culture's version of it. And so if you're going to get into it, it does help to maybe have some access to their culture, It's not so easy in America. I get it because, that brings up the question of what is black culture, the Christian culture, the hood culture, whatever it is, but you at least should be having some idea of where these traditions come from. And I think a lot of people forget when they come into voodoo, they come into the African traditional religions, that it's rooted in something. It's rooted in a struggle. It's rooted in an experience from people that were brought here against their will while they were, completely, the colonizers destroying everyone on this continent that was indigenous as well. There's a story there that cannot be forgotten. And once you at least can grasp that story, you're coming at it from another angle. And if you still are compelled, then sure. But if you're just diving into it for spell's sake and just to dabble, then it's probably not a good idea. These are not sensational things. They're very reverent, heartfelt things that mean a great deal to a lot of people. And if anybody is involved in it, it's from an outside place, and you're in it, you're lucky. And therefore, you should really try to help. If you're going to be a white person or an Asian person, South Asian, you're going to come into these practices, just like anybody else would be going through depression. Have some reverence for where these places came from, and then you're much more apt to not get yourself in trouble, to come across danger or else. If you're lucky, sometimes it's still happens.
Yeah, those are both really, really great pieces of advice, and for me, like I've meshed up a little bit of the Native American traditions with Wicca traditions, and I've kind of made my own little thing. I just learned a new term for it because it's called eclectic witch. I never really considered anything like a term for it. I just thought this is what feels like home for me. And then on occasion, as you know, I've gotten messages through dreams or, spirit just tells me things, and they show me how to do certain things. And sometimes it does have that like voodoo style, if you will, to it. And so that's when I ask questions to Atu and Tim Shaw and a bunch of other people, and I'm like, does this actually make any sense? Is there any validation to what I'm being taught? And then I take it from there. But I don't usually, if I don't know it, I don't usually I don't just dive into it. So I always make sure to ask the questions, learn it first, and then go from there.
I mean, think about it. How many people out there are completely, just faking it to make it or something, posing as a Native American practitioner, some white person, calling themselves Eagle Dove, and they're teaching people sweat lodges and all sorts of these things.
Yeah.
In fact, to be honest, I think probably the most appropriated spiritual tradition is the Native American and First Nations, like hands down, bar none. That is the most, and that is something that every part of the period somehow at times seems to be really, and the New Age community is filled with it. And they outnumber pagans, and I think the pagan community will do its best to, police itself. Sometimes it takes a while in certain outcrops and certain enclaves to get their shit together, but most times if something egregious is happening, it will be dealt with and the people will speak up. And so, because I know some, in the 90s and stuff, there was just way too many people doing way too much Native American themed, faux magic and stuff, and luckily that's been eradicated, because luckily there's been more people that are native that have been attending pagans, communities, so it kind of helps.
Yeah, one of the terms for it is plastic shamanism.
Right.
And yeah, it's actually my next teaser episode that's going to be coming out the day before Thanksgiving is actually about sacred cleansing, and we kind of get into a little bit about how the sacredness of things like sage and Palo Santo isn't being handled properly. It's losing that. So to me, the creator is actually taking these things away from us, because sage is actually depleting, and so is Palo Santo. And then, how we're harvesting it isn't correct unless you're actually growing it and doing it all, the correct way. The way it's being harvested by these companies isn't correct. It's just for money. And then certain people are actually going into places that it's being farmed and stealing it, which is also not honoring it. And I do understand that, the spiritual peoples, like, we do have a right to these herbs, but at no means should you steal them, because it kind of puts a nasty thing on it, but it's how things are now. So Palo Santo and some of the sages, they are going extinct, if you will, and we talk about a little bit of that, because people are saging everything too. So I've actually had Spirit tell me that basically it's not going to do a whole lot of work anymore, because it'll clear like your negative energies, but it's not going to do much for like house cleansing and stuff and getting rid of like big entities or anything like that, just because everybody's using it constantly. It's kind of like spirits are building an immunity to it, in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, we get deep into that conversation. Actually, it's with Tim Shaw, Alani Milligan, and Billy Lynmuth that we all kind of discuss it.
Hmm. All right, well, Tim Shaw's the man.
Yeah, it's a pretty good conversation. So if you guys get a chance to kind of go into it, we did, if you do take steps to put that honor back into it and put the good intent and everything back into it, you are going to build its mojo back up. But as it sits naturally, I guess like right out of its package, if you will, it's not holding too much. And I do believe the creator will replace it with something, but I don't know what that is yet. So
Florida water.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, right?
So, yeah, actually one of the things that I use the most in my craft when it comes to like grounding and protection and all that is actually cinnamon. It works wonderful for me, so that's what I use.
There's cinnamon in Florida water.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love it. It's something I've always been drawn to ever since I was little too, so that could be why I needed more grounding growing up. So.
Interesting.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for being on my show. I really enjoyed talking to you guys and getting out all this wonderful, wonderful information. It really means a lot to me that you guys could be here today.
Yeah, no problem. And you look for myself and Lilith. Contact us on our Facebook pages. Look for us, Witch Dr. Voodoo and Lilith Dorsey, and come and check us out. See what we're up to. You'll probably end up seeing us together sometimes, actually.
That happens a lot. And I love it. And look for my new book, Orisha's Goddesses and Voodoo Queens. Like, here's my, semi-big announcement. It's coming out on May 1st. So everybody, look for that.
Awesome.
Yes, definitely. I will definitely keep an eye out for both of your books. Very exciting.
Oh, well, thank you.
Great. Have a good night.
That's
Great. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Yes.
Bye. Bye.
Thank you for joining my circle tonight. It was a pleasure to discuss this spooky topic with you, and a thank you to all my listeners for tuning in. And as always, dreadful dreams. Remember, my darlings, to always be kind to those around you, including our friends with claws, fangs, and fur. Hello, darling. Love the show and want to be more involved? All while showing your support? Have I got the perfect thing for you? Subscribe to my Patreon page today, and as a patron, you'll have the option to select which tier you are interested in, with exclusive patron-only offers from early access, live stream chats, shoutouts, distant readings, and so much more. If this has piqued your interest, please follow the link in the chat or go to patreon.com and search Cauldron Talk with Casey Colburn and become a patron today. Thank you for your support, darlings, and as always, dreadful dreams.